my cervical vertebra to go back, or depends if I'm in anatomical position or not. Let me do this. If I'm trying to catch a ball and I'm trying to keep my eyes level, as my trunk goes one way, my eyes to stay level, my cervical vertebra is going to bend the other. So this would be left lateral cervical bending. In other words, if I froze it and I came back to anatomical position, my head would be left ear, left shoulder. Okay? So this would be left ear, left shoulder, left lateral. This would be right ear, right shoulder, right lateral. Okay? This would be right transverse cervical rotation. Again, the illusion is that my eyes didn't go anywhere. That's okay, because eyes don't have rotation. The vertebrae themselves have rotation. So when I do this, there's motion. Once again, if there wasn't motion, it would look like this. Right? Everything stayed in its place. So even though, this is the illusion, even though it appears my trunk went to the left, this part had to spin to the right in order to keep my eyes. If they both went left, it would look like this. But if one part is going to spin left, and I'm trying to keep my eyes on something, functional circle of sight, I need that other part to cancel out what's going this way by going this way, even though it doesn't appear like it's happening. Okay? So if I went the other way, left transverse, right transverse, left transverse, right transverse, left transverse, right transverse, left transverse. Now, I'm talking about cervical. We're going to get to the trunk in a little bit, okay? But cervical, this is right, this is left. Any questions about that? All right, buddy? Now let's look at trunk. Trunk flexion, trunk extension, right lateral trunk bending, left lateral trunk bending, right transverse trunk rotation. Notice the creasing. Left transverse trunk rotation. Right transverse, left transverse. Now the illusion might come when I move my trunk, but I don't move my head. So in that regard, there was motion on both the trunk and the cervical vertebra, even though it may not appear that both of them were moving. As my trunk twisted to the left, left transverse trunk rotation, my cervical vertebra had to be twisting to the right at the exact same angular velocity in order to keep my eyes level. Another way to look at it too is if a batter, I mentioned this on Monday, but if a batter is trying to keep their eye on the ball and their pelvis is trying to take everything and spin it to the left, you have to have right transverse cervical rotation to keep your eye on the ball. The illusion is that your head doesn't move, and it doesn't. But the reason your head doesn't move is because you have cervical rotation that's keeping it in the same place as you have other parts below it that are trying to spin it out of place. Got it? Okay. So right transverse trunk, left transverse trunk. Right transverse trunk, left transverse trunk. And then we get into the pelvis. The pelvis has a perspective. Regardless of hips, regardless of trunk, it's all about how it spins. Hey pelvis, how are you spinning? Got a basketball, you bring a basketball on Friday. This is how I look at it. This is how I view it. I like to look at the basketball. Some people like to look at the cup of water. It doesn't matter as long as you're seeing the same thing. If I have a basketball and I spin it like this, when it hits the ground, it's going to roll forward, right? Forward, anterior, right? Anterior cruciate, anterior surface, front. So if my pelvis rolls forward, that's anterior pelvic girdle rotation. And it doesn't matter how it happens. It can roll forward on my right hip. It can roll forward on my left hip. It can roll forward on both hips. So in other words, from the pelvis's perspective, it doesn't care how it did it. it's rolling forward. So in other words, there's no such thing as right hip anterior pelvic girdle rotation because it has nothing to do with the hip. It's all about how is the pelvis spinning. So regardless of whether I do it this way, or this way, it's the same motion of the pelvis. The pelvis is spinning forward. The opposite of spinning forward, spinning back. If I put back spin on the ball and it hit the ground, it would roll back. It would roll posterior. Posterior pelvic girdle rotation. And it doesn't matter if it's on one hip, the other hip, both hips spinning back. It doesn't matter if it's about the trunk. How is the pelvis spinning? Okay. Then we had right lateral and left lateral. Again, some people might look at it as tipping the water over the right side or left side. I like to look at the basketball spin. If my pelvis does this, and I impart that direction of roll of spin, it's going to roll to the right side. Right side, right lateral pelvic girdle rotation. Left lateral pelvic girdle rotation. And again, that right lateral and left lateral can occur a lot of different ways. It could be about one hip. It could be about the other hip. It could be about both. And it could be about the trunk. If I was hanging on the Roman chair. And then transverse pelvic girdle rotation. Look to the right, look to the right, look to the right. Right transverse pelvic, left transverse pelvic. Right transverse cervical, right transverse trunk, right transverse pelvic.
Can you do one that's versus of just the trunk extension and flexion, and then what the difference of the pelvic one would be? I mean, the trunk flexion and extension versus like pelvic.
You got it.
For that same,
Yeah.
What it would look like?
And guide me to make sure that I'm doing the example that you're asking. So here's one of the things before I get into that, is that you're never guaranteed to have pelvic girdle rotation with anything. And the reason is because my pelvis can move about hip, it can move about trunk, or it can do both. So like I can have, if I was in a back brace, I could have anterior pelvic girdle rotation and not have any trunk motion at all, right? Mm-hmm. And I could have posterior without any trunk motion. And if I'm hanging from a bar and I was in like a leg cast, I could have all of the different pelvic girdle rotations and not have hip motion. Okay? So that's the first thing, is that make sure you don't always associate, when I see this kind of pelvic girdle rotation, I have automatic. Okay. So back to your question, which I think was your question. If I have, so let's say I start here. Start here, and I do this. Okay. Now, I could be in a cast, and I mean, as long as the cast doesn't come into my trunk, right? But I could literally face my hips and still bring my knees closer to my shoulders because I'm rotating my pelvis about my trunk, right? So again, it's the illusion of, well, hips are moving, but in reality, the femurs are just going along for the ride because they're attached to the pelvis. So in that example, how would the pelvis be rotating? Would the basketball be rolling backwards, or would the basketball be rolling forward? Back, yeah, backwards, right? So this part, now, it's a fluctuation, but this part right here would be backward spin, forward spin, backward spin, forward spin, posterior, anterior, posterior, anterior. Now, what's happening to the trunk? Wow, because that pelvis can't just rotate on its own. Something else has to move to allow that pelvis to do this. I mean, the only way the pelvis can rotate on its own without having any subsequent motion, whether it's trunk or hips, is to literally break it apart and then do this with it. You know, if the pelvis is rotating in your body, something else is making it or allowing it to rotate. In this case, it's the trunk. So let's look at how the trunk, I'm going to draw some very simple, because that's all I can draw. It's simple, as you guys can tell.